Welcome everyone to our webinar presented by NMEAC, the Northern Michigan Environmental Action Council. This is 1 Square Foot, the Threat of Neonicotinoid Pesticides. My name is Bill Latka. I help NMEAC and a bunch of other companies do their communications and websites and digital stuff. And I am pleased tonight to present Dan Raichel, Director, Pollinators and Pesticides and Nature at National Resources Defense Council. He focuses on protecting our nation's bee populations through their health and existence, in particular the use of bee-toxic pesticides. Before joining the Nature program at NRDC, Dan was co-director of NRDC's Community Fracking Defense Project and an advocate for the cleanup of industrial pollution in the New York region. Welcome, Dan. We're so glad you're here.
Well, thanks everyone for having me. Here today to talk a little bit about neonicotinoid pesticides, and Bill, I think you did a pretty good job of that. It took me. I work on this issue. This is my job, and I think it took me about a year and a half to get there on neonicotinoids. But neonics for short. That's an easier thing to say. Just wanted to talk a little bit about these pesticides. You may have heard of them before. Most folks probably haven't. But why we think that these are some of the most ecologically destructive pesticides we've seen since DDT, and what folks are doing across the world and across the country to eliminate wasteful uses of these pesticides in ways that can really help the environment and public health. So to kick things off, pollinators, bees and other pollinators. You can see I have a bee bee in the background here. I think most folks on the call would recognize that bees are incredibly important species. 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we take comes from pollination provided by bees and other pollinators. And to give you a sense of what that looks like in the real world, here is a grocery store in the world that we live in now with bees and other pollinators. And here's what that grocery store looks like without bees and other pollinators. So certainly we would still have food. We would just lose a lot of our most delicious and nutritious options. We would have a lot less food, and it would all be a lot more expensive. Beyond the grocery store aisle, bees and other pollinators are also incredibly important to the functioning of entire ecosystems. About 80% of the plants on the face of the earth, terrestrial plants, require bees or some sort of pollinator to reproduce. So if we lose our pollinators, we worry not only about food security issues, but also the collapse of whole ecosystems. And essentially, that's what we started to worry about a whole lot more in the mid-2000s. So starting at that time, beekeepers across the country and across the world started to see their annual losses of honeybee colonies shoot through the roof. Up until that point, beekeepers were losing maybe 10 or 15% of their colonies every year. And those numbers jumped to 30, 40, 50% virtually overnight. And they have persisted to this day. Actually, last year was the worst year on record for honeybee losses across the United States. And what you see too is, in the old days, beekeepers really wouldn't lose their bees during the summer. And so you can see they didn't even used to count summer losses, but in some years, the summer losses have actually been higher than the winter losses. Now the annual losses are the numbers that we look at. And again, beekeepers losing over 50% of their colonies every year. Now, honeybees are livestock. The species is actually not native to the United States. They were brought over here for pollination services. And there's a whole industry that breeds and replaces these honeybee colonies. So even though we keep losing bees at sort of this massive rate every year, honeybee colonies have stayed relatively stable. But the same can't be said about our wild bees. So there are a lot of problems affecting bees and other pollinators. Why are we talking about neonics. I mean, there's climate change, there's habitat loss, there's parasites, pathogens. Our pollinators are dying a death of 1,000 cuts in some sense, but there's one cut that is deeper than the rest. And those are the neonicotinoid pesticides. So why are we so concerned about neonics, even above other pesticides, right? And there's three big reasons. So the first issue with neonics is that they are super duper toxic to bees and other insects. They are among the most insect toxic pesticides or potent insecticides ever created. And to give you a sense of scale here, just one neonic treated corn seed has enough active ingredient to kill 250,000 bees. And I'm sorry, I got the wrong title slide for this presentation, but the other fact here is 1 square foot of treated lawn with a neonic at EPA approved rates has enough active ingredient to kill 1 million bees. 1 square foot, 1 million bees. So very, very potent insecticides. That's issue one. And we've seen, and here's the chart that really makes the connection come alive. So neonics have made U.S. agriculture about 48 times more harmful to insect life since their introduction. And where we see this harmfulness spike, right, that's almost exactly the point that we see mass losses of honeybee colonies across the country, right? It's right at this point. And as you can see, neonic use has increased since then. And it's primarily as coatings on seeds, known as seed treatments, and I'll talk about that right now. Second problem with neonics is that they're very good at polluting whole ecosystems. They are designed to permeate plants, which means they get into the leaves, the roots, the pollen, the nectar, everything. And the idea is the plant itself becomes pesticidal. The plant itself becomes toxic. And that allows neonics to be applied in all sorts of new and interesting ways, or at least it did in the 90s when neonics were first introduced. They were sort of the first major systemic insecticide, the first insecticide that works in this way. But the most common way that neonics are applied are as these seed coatings known as seed treatments. So this is a picture. This has not been digitally altered. These are neonic coated corn seeds in a planter before planting. They're required to colorize the seed to make folks know that, let folks know that there's a toxic pesticide on that seed. And the idea is, as that seed is growing into a plant, it soaks up the pesticide coating and becomes toxic, all parts of it, right? And that's, theoretically how the plant is protected. The only problem is only 2 to 5% make it into that target crop. The other 95+% stay in the environment where they persist for years, the vast majority in the soil, and same properties that let the neonics get up into those target plants mean that they're very mobile in the environment. So anytime it rains, anytime there's irrigation, anytime there's lawn watering, if it's one of those lawn applications, those neonics are moving through the soil. They're contaminating new soil. If there's plants in that soil, they soak up the pesticides, they become toxic, their pollen, their nectar. If there's a water supply nearby, that water supply becomes polluted. Third problem with neonics is they are just all over the place. So they are the most popular insecticides in the US and worldwide, most widely used. And they are maybe the most widely deployed insecticides in US history. Certainly they're all over farms, and to give you a sense, just about every conventional corn seed is pre-treated with a neonic before planting. 2/3 of soybean seeds, a good portion of wheat seeds and other field crops as well. but they're also all over lawns, gardens, golf courses, you name it. Just about bed bug products, pet products, anywhere where you'd have an interest in killing a bug, there's often a neonic product for that use. And to give you a sense of what that looks like nationally, this is what neonic use looks like just for agricultural uses. This is not including non-ag uses. As you notice, there's like these blank spaces around Chicago and Detroit and other urban areas. If we were looking at those non-ag uses, those lawn and garden uses, believe me, those areas would be filled in, and they would actually be, in some cases, a lot darker than the ag use areas, because actually those non-agricultural uses are approved at much higher rates per acre than in agriculture, sometimes 10 times as high. But what this map does give you a sense of is that we are using these pesticides just about everywhere. And we're using them in the same areas year after year after year. And they are leaving every year 95% of, with the seed coatings, 95% of that coating in the soil. That coating is persisting for years and years and years in the soil. And so what you get from that year over year use is a buildup of toxicity in the soil that is constantly expanding every time it rains to get into every nook and cranny of the ecosystem: soil, water, plant life, wildlife. So that in a nutshell is the problem with neonics, or the scope of the contamination. We certainly see that contamination in Michigan. Federal testing has found neonics year-round in tributaries to the Great Lakes, and these are tributaries that have a decent amount of water flowing through them. So it's actually pretty amazing that we're seeing these, every month of the year, we're seeing neonics in these water bodies. And other federal testing around the state shows that about 40% of samples have neonics above EPA benchmarks that for harm to aquatic ecosystems, right? That is the level that EPA would assume that ecosystem is being damaged and sort of hollowed out. So, right, again, that's the nature of the contamination. What is that? What are all the impacts of that? So the first is that neonics are definitely killing bees. And that's something that we suspected 20 years ago. It's very much confirmed in the science at this point. Industry did try to fight that for a long time, but they also funded this study. This, when it came out, was the largest field study, and I think it still is, in the world. And the manufacturers that funded the study actually questioned its conclusions, but it came to the conclusion that these pesticides, including the neonic seed treatments, were harmful to honeybee colonies. But this was just a study of honeybees, and there's been many, many others, but this is the most notable one. We also now, just last year, got a good study finding the connection between neonics and losses of wild bees across the country. This is a really amazing paper, but we know that what is affecting honeybees and wild bees, which, by the way, are responsible for up to about 50% of the pollination that we get for our fruits and vegetables. What's true for bees is also true for other pollinators. So this is, and actually I just noticed now that picture in the New York Times is actually from St. Joseph, Michigan. But this is a study that came out also in 2024, finding that neonics were the number one driver of losses of Midwestern butterflies over the last 20 years, and in particular monarch butterflies, which is interesting. But what is unique about this study is that it actually looked at all of the different factors. It looked at climate change, habitat loss, parasites, pathogens, and it found that neonics were the number one cause of those losses, and in particular, the use of neonic-treated seeds, right? That is the number one factor associated with the loss of butterflies. You know, some people think butterflies are frivolous and may think the same about bees, but we know that these species are indicator species, right? We don't count all of our wildlife, certainly not our insect wildlife. We're drawn to bees and we're drawn to butterflies, and they're like a warning signal here. Honeybees were our initial warning signal, our canary in the coal mine. But what scientists do know is that we're losing our invertebrate life across the board. Some have called it an insect apocalypse. That may be a little bit overblown. But the fact is, we have way fewer bugs in our environment than we used to even 20 or 30 years ago. And for those folks who may remember, as far back as, the 1990s, driving through a rural area in summertime, you'd have to turn on your windshield wipers, whether it was raining or not, just to get all the bugs off of your windshield. And think about when the last time was that was really necessary. I mean, certainly it still does happen in some areas, but it's much rarer than it used to be. It's also worth noting that farmers feel these effects of loss of insects as well. We know that neonics harm bees and other pollinators that are critical to the production of fruit and vegetables, but they also harm the insects that are critical to restoring nutrients to the soil, like earthworms and other decomposers. A lot of farmers get free pest control from predatory insects, right? The good bugs that eat the bad bugs. But as it turns out, neonics are much better at killing those pest predators often than they are at killing pests. And it sort of makes sense. One of the defining features of pests is that they're very good at evading some of these controls and breeding very rapidly. There's even some new studies showing that neonics can hurt the insects that control weed pressure as well. And then, of course, that neonics can damage soil health directly by attacking the microbes in that soil. And some good research from MSU also finds that top crops in the state, apples, blueberries, and cherries, are already pollinator limited, meaning those yields of those crops are already limited because of a lack of pollinators, whether that's wild pollinators or managed honeybees. Beyond bugs on land, we know that neonics also can get into aquatic ecosystems and do real damage there too. This is from a study from Japan that was looking at zooplankton. And here's a picture of zooplankton for folks who don't know. It's essentially water bugs. And very interestingly, they had started looking at zooplankton populations in this otherwise sustainable fishery, this lake, starting in the 1980s. And then they realized in the early 1990s, that population just hit a wall, just flatlined. Unsurprisingly, the fish that ate those zooplankton, they noticed that the fishermen, their catches of these fish also hit a wall at the same time, probably because they had no food and they couldn't reproduce and grow in population. So the study authors later connected it to the introduction of neonics in nearby agriculture. Japan actually approved these pesticides first before the United States. And it's really hard to get a study like this these days because, again, neonics are everywhere now, right? So you would have had to start the study before the introduction of neonics and them just sort of permeating the environment. But what this does tell us is that these pesticides are extremely potent and they have major impacts on ecosystems. And this is one of the more dramatic examples, but likely the same thing is happening across Michigan and across the United States, because the levels that we're talking about here are very small, like parts per trillion. Also worth noting that neonics are toxic to things with spines. One neonic treated corn seed has enough active ingredient to kill a small songbird if ingested, and songbirds do ingest neonic treated seeds at the time of planting. But even at levels that don't kill birds outright, they can interfere with their ability to navigate, to find food, to migrate, to reproduce. So even if that consumption of that seed doesn't kill the bird outright, it may ultimately lead to the death of the bird or the death of that population. Now, where things start to get scary is where we start to see effects in mammals. So neonics are, neonicotinoid itself, the word, means new nicotine-like substance. And it works on nerves that respond to nicotine. Basically, neonics in insects are designed to bind to the nerve site that responds to nicotine and not let go, and stimulate that nerve again and again and again and again and again until the nerve fails. So if you've seen a bee that has been acutely poisoned with a neonic, oftentimes that bee will start to twitch uncontrollably before becoming paralyzed and dying. But our bodies respond to nicotine as well, right? And although the particular receptor that neonics target are not as prevalent in our bodies, we do have them in very sensitive areas of our brain and central nervous system. So this study that is on this slide came out of farmers in the upper Midwest hunters in the upper Midwest, noticing that strange things were happening with the deer that they had caught. There was some they were seeing strange sort of issues with the deer, and they were wondering if that might be related to the use of these insecticides. And so a controlled study was done. And what they found was that sort of real world levels of neonics that the deer were fed in their water supply, levels you would find in these areas, resulted for those deer that were exposed in the womb, so prenatally exposed, malformations, sort of congenital malformations, including the jawbone, strange things going on with the body and organ sizes, including the liver, the spleen, and the genitals, increased rates of stillbirth for fawns, so mortality. And then in the adults, they noticed hormonal issues, including lethargy. And interestingly enough, even in this study, they tried to have a control group without neonics in them, but neonics are so prevalent in the environment, there were actually some neonics in the control group, although at much, much lower levels. But just again, a testament to how prevalent these are in our environment. So the refrain from industry after that study was conducted was that, that doesn't matter, because you can feed a deer enough Mountain Dew and you can find effects, but deer are not being exposed to Mountain Dew in the wild. Deer do not have these levels of neonics in their body in real life. Well, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources actually did a study on that, and they had deer hunters submit spleens. I think in 2019, they collected over 800 spleens, and if you can imagine 800 spleens moving to the males through to the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And what they found was that about 60% of deer in the state had neonics in their bodies, with 29% at or above levels associated with the higher rates of birth defects and death for fawns in the Berheim study. They redid that survey in 2021, or that study, and found that 94% of deer in the state had neonics in their body, with 64% at levels associated with higher rates of birth defects and death in the Berheim study. So big jump in just 2 years. And what was interesting is they were finding these pesticides in the deer's body regardless of where the deer were caught. Urban areas, suburban areas, agricultural areas, up in the boundary waters, not next to anything. It didn't matter. They were finding neonics were showing up just about everywhere. Now, deer are large mammals, and so are we. And if you think that we are immune from the neonics in our environment, we are not. We know from CDC data, thousands of Americans tested from 2015, 2016, that about half of the American population on any given day has neonics in their body. We haven't gotten updated data since then, but hopefully some will be published soon. A more recent study of hundreds of pregnant women across the country found that about 95+%, it was actually 96, of those women had neonics in their body. And this was a 4-year study. And what was troubling about it is that it matches those, somewhat matches the results from the Minnesota study, in that those levels were rising every year, both in the number of women that had neonics in their body and the levels that were detected in those women. And all of those levels were higher, or a lot of those levels were higher than from the CDC testing too. So how do people become exposed to neonics? They can eat contaminated food and drink contaminated water. Those are probably the two main exposure pathways. With food, because neonics permeate food, they can't be washed or peeled off. The pesticides aren't on the apple, they're in the apple. And with water, most water treatment does not remove neonics from water supplies. So if you have neonics in your source water, chances are you're going to have neonics in your tap water, although some of the modern filtration that's being done to get rid of PFAS would also likely remove neonics. And then people come into contact with neonics just sort of using neonic products. We know more research needs to be done, but the studies that we do have link neonic exposures similarly to birth defects of the heart and brain, cognitive impairment, autism spectrum disorder, and then in adults, a host, again, very similar to what we see in animal studies, a host of reproductive system harms, decreased sperm quantity and quality, decreased testosterone, some metabolic effects as well. And actually, we don't have this on the slide yet, but the animal studies confirm some of these similar harms. We have rodent studies that show that exposure in the womb leads to thinning of key areas of the brain. Again, poor sperm quantity and quality. And the one we don't have up here yet, but we just got a study on, is that neonics can, in mice, also affected the formation of egg follicles. So we now see effects both in males and in females that could affect fertility and reproduction. Right. And also, sorry, I should note too that sometimes the breakdown products of neonics in the bodies, when we metabolize them, when we break them down, can be even more toxic than the parent compounds. So I know I've been talking for a long time, but I think, we've done the doom and gloom. What are folks doing about neonic pollution across the globe and in this country? And here, I think there is some more heartening news, because there's some really promising models that are emerging and are beginning to be adopted, across the board. So Europe was the first to act on neonics. They partially banned the 3 major neonic chemicals in 2013. They expanded that ban in 2018 to cover just about all outdoor uses. They did it to protect pollinators. Nobody else has gone with the complete ban model. Canada almost did it to protect aquatic ecosystems, but they sort of backed off at the last minute. But the national government has way more restrictions on neonic use than we have here in the United States. But the provinces decided to go further. So Ontario and Quebec introduced prescription systems for the use of neonic coatings on corn and soybean. Basically, that if you wanted to use a neonic as a coating on a corn or a soybean seed or other field crop seeds like wheat or oats, you need to get a prescription from an agronomist, or at least that's the system in Quebec. Ontario changed its system, so you can self-certify now. But you'd have to get a prescription from an agronomist saying that that coating is treating a legitimate pest risk, that it's not just being used prophylactically. Because here's the biggest secret about neonics on these crop seeds is that test after test, study after study shows that they rarely, if ever, provide economic benefits to farmers. Very rarely do they provide any yield advantage. But even when they do, the pesticide companies, which, by the way, are the same companies that make the seeds, think Bayer Monsanto or Dow DuPont, which is now Corteva, or Syngenta. These coatings are pushed by industry, but what the study shows, again, very rarely are they providing yield advantage. But even when they do, that extra charge that the pesticide companies charge for those seed coatings, sort of like getting the hot wax at the car wash, I mean, that costs money. And so that yield advantage, even the very, very rare circumstances when there is one, is sort of washed out by the fact that farmers are being charged more for having these pesticide coatings on the seed. So these treated seeds, again, that's, if you can remember back to the chart where we see sort of the spike in toxicity from agriculture, almost all of that is the seeds, right? That's where we really started to see bees just drop off the map. It's being driven by these seed coatings. And what we know is that this use is wasteful and unnecessary. And Quebec is the example here. As soon as they instituted that prescription system, again, just like if you need it, use it, but don't use it if you don't need it. Neonic use rates on seeds fell dramatically. Before that point, it looked a lot like the United States. About 100% of corn and 50% of soybean were treated, and those numbers dropped to less than 0.3%, 0.03%, and 0% respectively. There really isn't neonics being used on soybean seeds in Quebec anymore. And importantly, there was no associated crop loss or switching to more harmful alternatives. The program was so successful that it's being expanded to all insecticides in 2025, because what the data shows is that really you don't need anything on these seeds. Okay. I'm going to run through this very quickly. So there's a bunch of things happening at the federal level in this country right now with respect to neonics. Reviews are going on. Neonics are being reviewed for their impact on endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. There's a process under our federal pesticide law, which is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, also known as FIFRA. It's a once every 15-year process to determine whether registered pesticides have unreasonable adverse impacts on the environment. And if they do, EPA has to do something about it. I don't think any of these processes are likely to yield meaningful restrictions on neonic use. Although we're following up with the agencies and trying to hold their feet to the fire and trying to work for those national restrictions, because that's ideally the limits would come from EPA. The last piece here is we do have what's known as a food tolerance petition to EPA. So the federal government actually sets limits on the amount of pesticides that can be found on foods or contained in foods. Those are known as food tolerances. It's part of the Food Quality Protection Act that, believe it or not, was passed unanimously in the early 90s. If you can believe that something would pass unanimously in Congress, much less a law about pesticides. But we think that EPA, without getting into the weeds here, has basically been cooking the math. Those levels of pesticides, those max levels, are set based upon scientific testing and relate to human health safety, particularly the safety of children and their neurological development, because we know children are much more sensitive to pesticides than adults, which makes sense, right? Particularly neurotoxic pesticides, because their brains are literally developing and growing, and it's an exceptionally sensitive process. So we think EPA has been cooking the math in terms of what the allowable levels of neonics in food should be. We petitioned the agency in 2020. They haven't gotten back to us yet. We sued them because they have not responded to us yet. And so I think there's going to be years of litigation on that, but we're going to continue to press the agency. In the meantime, states are not waiting for EPA. They're not waiting for Godot, right? They're taking action into their own hands. And states have done a number of things to that effect. At the first set of laws or restrictions were these laws called restricted use laws. Basically, it takes neonics off of the shelves at Home Depot or Lowe's. It gets rid of those consumer uses, but any certified applicator can still use them. So think like, lawn care specialists or pest control specialists, landscapers, they're all certified applicators, or they contract with one, or they have one on staff. And so it doesn't eliminate a lot of the lawn and garden use, but it does eliminate the over-the-counter stuff. And it doesn't affect agriculture. So New Jersey and then also Maine and Nevada were some of the leading states in just banning lawn and garden uses across the board. So even certified applicators, even your lawn care specialist can't use neonics in those states. And that was sort of the next step, and it made a lot of sense in New Jersey. Not a lot of corn and soybean in New Jersey, but a lot of lawns. And actually, I didn't update this slide, but Connecticut actually passed its bill. Vermont did not. Connecticut is now one of the states that have banned lawn and garden uses. And then this is where things really get exciting. New York, a couple of years ago, passed a bill known as the Birds and Bees Protection Act. It was the nation's first restrictions on neonic-treated seeds, and that's the big fish, right? That's where 80 to 90% of the use is. It follows the Quebec model. It's a prescription model. Again, if you need to use it, if there's an actual pest need, you get a prescription and you can use it, or in New York, it's called a waiver. And if you don't need to use it, don't use it. So again, that follows the Quebec model, and it takes effect in 2029. And then California is beginning to exercise regulatory control over treated seeds generally. I don't want to get into this, but too deep. But what makes the treated seed issue even more vexing is that treated seeds are not directly regulated as pesticides virtually anywhere in the United States. States regulate the products that are used to spray, to treat the seeds, to put the pesticide on the seeds. But once you have a pesticide-coated seed, most states do not regulate, or basically virtually all states do not regulate that as a pesticide, which causes all sorts of problems. So California may be the first to close this loophole regulatorily. And then Minnesota also prohibited neonics on public lands, and we've petitioned the state to go further. So what can you do in Michigan? So we've had a coalition letter go out to MDARD. NMEAC was on that letter. I think we are still, I know that we're still accepting organizational sign-ons. So if you know of other orgs that might want to sign the letter, feel free to send them the link and have them sign on, because we can always re-up the letter. If we get enough additional signatories, we can always send it back to MDARD and show that there's support for the agency doing something. We do think that MDARD has authority to rein in the use of neonic-treated seeds. But there's also, and I know right now in the legislature, it does not look like there is a viable pathway towards pesticide legislation in the state. But it is an issue that I think more and more folks care about these days, that's resonating with a lot of people, that resonates across the aisles. And I think it's always helpful for your representatives to hear about issues that matter. So if this is an issue that matters to you, please reach out to your representatives and tell them that you think that Michigan should join some of these other states in the vanguard and do something about harmful and completely needless and wasteful and dumb neonic pollution in Michigan. And also, here's the link for staying in touch with us. So I've talked for a really long time. I'm going to stop sharing and take questions.
Thanks very much, Dan. That was amazing. Does anybody have any questions for Dan? And you can feel free to just unmute yourself and ask. No need to type them. While we're waiting for people to think, Dan, have you had any response from MDARD yet about this?
They got our letter and we're trying to set up a time to talk.
Anyone have any questions?
Has Quebec done any studies in terms of insect population recovery or reductions in measurable neonics in their soils or water?
So, no across the board except for water. And this is also the same problem in Europe. Folks didn't take like baseline data for a number of species or for soil. The only place that we have that baseline data is for water. And we have seen in Quebec, neonic levels in water drop dramatically. So the good news about neonics is that they are not forever chemicals. They are relatively persistent in soils, but they do break down eventually. In Quebec's system has been in place for about 7 years. So we are seeing those neonic levels drop in water, which is really encouraging. And there was also, in terms of rebounding populations, we saw in France recently, there was a study that came out that showed that bird populations were recovering after the neonic ban, albeit slowly. But I think one of the things they found in Europe is that neonics are hanging around in the environment a lot longer than people thought they would. But again, the levels do appear to be coming down, and they're at least with the bird populations, there does appear to be some slow recovery, which is really heartening.
Do you hear me? I have a question. Actually, I have two questions. First of all, when we look at a chemical on a pesticide, not that I'm going to buy a pesticide, but I'd like to know what the name of the chemical might be that's in the thing you buy at Home Depot that would identify as a neonic. Is that?
Yeah. So to answer that question, before you ask your second, they make it hard. So it's not like you look at all pesticides are going to have a pesticide label. right? And you can look at that label to know what the active ingredient is. But the active ingredient is not neonics or neonicotinoids. That's just the name of the class of chemicals that they belong to. So the 5 major chemicals that you have to look out for, and maybe I should put it in the chat, are acetamiprid, dinoteffurin, imidacloprid, clothianidin, and thiamethoxam. Those are the big 5. I'll try to put that in the chat.
That'd be great, because those, I probably won't remember those very long if I remember them now. So the second thing is an observation. We spent a number of years in Kenya, and there was the seed coatings that you're talking about. We were there building a cancer facility in the city of Eldoret, and there was a very high spike in cervical cancer. And I'm wondering if there's been any studies done in Africa that would, or even in the United States, that would link the coatings that you're talking about to cancers. It was, I mean, the spikes were stunning, particularly critical.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so a couple of things to mention there. One, neonics are not the only pesticides on seeds. So just about every seed is treated with a fungicide, and there are other chemicals, nematicides, in addition to the neonic coating. So things can get a little bit complicated, especially when you're talking about, like these epidemiological studies. But what we do see is actually some research from China, a lot more on human health there actually than from the United States, some from Europe. And then, of course, the animal studies. And what we see, I have not seen a link to cancer yet. I wouldn't be surprised if we found one eventually. But what we are seeing very clearly are neurological risks, neurological impacts, particularly for prenatally exposed either babies or baby mice, or, I mean, those effects are very clear. And it's easy to see why, right? Again, neonics are water soluble. They pass from the pregnant mother to the fetus through that shared blood flow. And they're designed to attack nerves, right? So very problematic during sensitive periods of brain development. And then also these hormonal effects with sperm and also to the female reproductive system. And we're seeing a lot more of that too, and other hormonal issues. And again, we're seeing that both in the human epidemiology and also confirmed in animal studies. So, and that body of evidence continues to grow.
Thank you very much for your answer and all your efforts.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm very happy to say this, but our Raichel Ratliff has a question. You raised your hand.
Hi there. Thank you so much for preparing this. That was really efficient and I learned a lot. I'm wondering if you know of any efforts that have been made to infiltrate the Make America Healthy Again movement. It just seems like some of those facts, especially surrounding fetuses in pregnancy, would really catch like wildfire with that group. I didn't know if maybe we were softballing anything in that direction, or if you know anything about that.
I think that, I mean, I'm not even sure you wouldn't have to infiltrate, right? I think the Make America Healthy Again movement is already there when it comes to toxics and pesticides. And, look, I think I'm not sure that my organization would always see eye to eye with all the positions of that movement. But I think there is a shared understanding that toxins, particularly from pesticides, are problematic for our health, for our children's health. And I think glyphosate gets a lot of the attention. So glyphosate, AKA Roundup, that is the nation's most used herbicide, right? The pesticides used to kill plants. Neonics are the nation's most used insecticides. So I think, and Secretary Kennedy used to work on glyphosate issues. So he's very steeped in all of the literature on that. But I think neonics don't get the attention that they should, right? They're incredibly prevalent in our environment, and they're neurotoxins, right? They're not designed to kill plants. They're designed to attack nerves. So I think neonics don't get the visibility that they deserve, but hopefully they will at some point soon.
Maybe step one would make them easier to pronounce.
I think that's part of it. With glyphosate, we have Roundup. Everybody can pronounce Roundup.
Yeah.
If it's okay, I have a second lighter question.
Yeah.
So recently my friend and I watched the most recent Yargos film, Bugonia, which features neonics quite prominently. Has that at all drawn any attention to this issue, do you think, in a real way?
Begonia, by the way, is a beautiful film, and Emma Stone is a national treasure. Also, I forget who the lead man in that. He was so good. The movie was amazing. Although
there's Emma Stone, just some dude.
Just some dude. Yeah, Jesse Plemons, amazing. Both of them amazing. Although for folks who haven't seen it, just FYI, it's a very strange movie and there is some violence. But given everything else going on in that movie, it's a little weird as a messaging piece, although it is the only movie. I saw it on my day off, and I was like, I couldn't believe that they were talking about neonicotinoids. I've never seen a movie that did that, but the information in that was pretty accurate. I thought they did a good job with it, but no, unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot of buzz from that movie on this issue, but hopefully it'll happen eventually.
All right. Any last questions from anybody in the group? So join me in thanking Dan Raichel for taking time out of his busy life to be here and keep us informed. And we will be watching. And I think we should all get on with our representatives and make some stuff happen here in Michigan.
Are we going to be able to get a copy of this presentation?
This is recorded, and we'll be sending it out to the group at some point, within the next week or two, as soon as I become unbusy. Looks like Cindy has a real quick question. Cindy, go ahead.
There we go. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yep, go ahead, Cindy.
Great. I wanted to ask, where can a everyday citizen get testing done for neonicotinoids in the presence in their food and in their water sources?
That's going to be very challenging. Because I know the Connecticut Coalition did some testing and they found a lab. I know that there are labs at Cornell that do some testing. I think there was a lab in Iowa that was doing testing, but I don't know the names off the top of my head. But the labs, typically you're talking for a test for all 5 neonics is going to run a couple $100, so it's not cheap. And for food, there are reports. I think Friends of the Earth did a report on neonics in food, and I think for food it's a little easier because organic produce, and I know not everybody can afford organic produce or maybe it's not available, but organic produce has often does not have neonics in them, and usually at much lower levels. You can't use neonics in organic production, although we do see it occasionally in some organic produce because, imagine if you're an organic farmer and your neighbor is a golf course or a cornfield and you're irrigating from the same water source. So it does get into organic production, but it's, again, much rarer at much lower levels. So you really wouldn't have to worry about it with that. And then with water, it is worth noting that granular active carbon filtration is pretty good at removing neonics. And that's the sort of filtration that you would have in a Brita filter. So it's just that water supplies, major water treatment facilities tend not to use that type of filtration because it's expensive. And so again, if you filter your water and you eat organic produce, I think you can greatly reduce your risk of exposure.
All right. And with that, we will let it go and let you get back to your nights. Thanks for all for joining. And thank you very much again, Dan. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, everybody. Thanks
very much, Dan.
Y'all have a good night.
Thank you.